Yeah.
All righty. Good day, everybody. Welcome to the Indicator of Behavior Working Group for the Open Cybersecurity Alliance. For those that, I think I know everybody on the call right now. So I'm Charlie Frick from Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. I'm the chair of the project and your host, and very much looking forward to our last meeting of 2022. Normally I would do some introductions, but I believe everybody here today, except for our speakers, Alan and Stuart, are repeat visitors, and I'll have our friends from Elemendar give their intros in a moment when they do their talk. So with that said, one of the things I wanted to bring up was, since we last met, we've been able to stand up our indicator behavior GitHub site for this project because we successfully transitioned to an OCA subproject. And now that we have that, at the moment, Kurt Korolenko and myself are the maintainers for the repository, but I'll also share in our meeting notes after this that'll go out on the Slack and the listserv that if any members of this effort are interested in serving as a repository maintainer, please reach out to me and we can most likely make that happen. If not, Kurt and myself will be happy to continue maintaining the repository. I know right now we've been some of the more frequent posters of content, but that's where we're hosting our reference implementations for our Stix behavior bundles, as well as right now we have a small script for translating Stix 2.1 bundles into Neo4j graph databases. And that'll be where additional projects are, little code snippets and reference implementations will be hosted. And for anyone that's interested in becoming a maintainer, we'd be glad to have your support. So that was the main plug I wanted to make for that. And again, I'll forward that through the Slack and the listserv to see if we have any other takers. But always happy to have help from our greater community. With that said, I wanted to give some time for what I found to be a very interesting technical talk today. I have a couple representatives from a company called Elemendar that I'd like them to showcase some of their capability for essentially natural language processing of threat intel and generation of Stix bundles. I think this could be of interest to this group because as we're looking for ways to represent cyber adversarial behavior in machine readable formats, I think we could get some good insight, especially during the Q&A, of what aspects we want to consider to make it easier for tools like this to identify those patterns. Because I definitely think as we look to scale out the capabilities that we discuss on this project, that the use of AI will play a pretty critical role in the future of it. So with that said, I'd like to pass the speaking torch over to our friends from Elemendar and give them a chance to introduce themselves, show us a little bit of capability, and hopefully have a very good discussion. So all yours, guys.
Brilliant. I suppose being British, I'm of course drowning in politeness, waiting for somebody else to come off. But I'll very quickly, hello, thank you, Charles, for that very kind introduction. My name is Stuart Bertram Barlett. Yorgos, or G, introduce himself as our kind of founder, and then we'll kick off from there.
So thanks for giving us the airtime. Really appreciate being in such a forward-thinking group, and the project is one that we've been very interested in following ever since our mutual friends at Johns Hopkins put us in touch. So I won't take very long before you get into the really interesting stuff that Stuart will show us. Just a few words about Elemendar. We started about 6 years ago at the UK's first GCHQ National Cybersecurity Accelerator. working directly with threat intel analysts and cyber defense operators to help them make use of threat intel. The problem that they'd encountered at the time, which is one that's very common across the industry, is of course there is too much threat intel. A lot of it is written in human readable form only. And of course, in order to become operational, it needs to be turned into some kind of configuration for a machine. That step is time consuming, manual, error prone, all those things that we don't like. And that's where we saw the opportunity to build some tech and help out with that. So what you're about to see is a product of those 5-6 years of investment since then, both on the ML side, of machine learning, natural language processing, and also on the tradecraft and analytic techniques, which is where Stuart's background lies. So without further ado, Stuart, over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Yorgos. Yeah, my name's Stuart Bertram. I'm the head of cyber threat intelligence here at Elementa. I've been here in the role for, I believe, exactly a year yesterday. However, previous to that, I've been working in cyber threat intelligence since 2009 and working in threat intelligence within a UK military concept since 2004. So very much here, I'm kind of representing the voice of the user, of analysts who are practicing and doing this kind of stuff on a daily basis. So what I would propose is obviously, just a couple of slides to kind of set the context around the tool, with the main part being a tool demonstration, and then just a few kind of slides as well to sort of close things out as well. But please don't stand on ceremony. Any kind of questions, anything you want to see, anything you want to kind of play around with, please just come off mute and shout out, and we can kind of take it from there. So just to kick off, hopefully you can all see the screen. I did get halfway through a presentation the other day, and somebody said, are you talking about anything? And clearly I hadn't turned on the screen share, so I do have previous history for that. So let's hope we'll avoid that today, and off we go. So I think, Charles, it was really interesting hearing your kind of talk and the centrality of artificial intelligence within your program. I thought that was a really interesting kind of point to talk about, and certainly something that we're seeing really within the wider kind of industry as well. We went to RSA kind of this year, and there was a couple of things people were kind of talking about. They were talking about zero trust environment, but they were also talking about, zero trust, behavioral indicators, but also this idea and this role of artificial intelligence as well. You can see just, even a brief kind of Google will sort of show you how powerful this is inside the industry, with Darktrace obviously basing their entire product really off artificial intelligence and machine learning, but also as well, other companies that haven't necessarily specialized in artificial intelligence in the past, looking to get that into their product, but also looking to do so in kind of a very visible way as well. So Recorded Future being one of those kind of proponents, and CrowdStrike as well. So two giants really within the industry who are very keen to sort of associate their kind of name with artificial intelligence in those areas as well. An interesting observation about the CTI landscape as well is a lot of people are quite critical of it because it's a lot of buzzwords and it's a lot of these things as well that people kind of talk about, which I think is a real shame because it does actually obscure very valid reasons for wanting to implement this technology and actually some quite crunchy implementations of that technology across that wider kind of industry sphere. We know these companies well, and we know they're doing good stuff within this kind of space. I think, again, to leverage my own kind of background as a threat intelligence analyst, if we look at the wider practice of artificial intelligence, people say, let's get AI into CTI, but my response is, well, where do you want to put it? Where do you want to situate it? And that, to me, is the biggest part that will make the difference between success and failure of your expectation around that tool, because ultimately it is kind of a tool. So if we look at the classic kind of intelligence cycle of direction, collection, analysis, and dissemination, you can see obvious areas where artificial intelligence programs can be applied. So direction is obviously, just one of the areas is mapping intelligence requirements to data sources. So passive DNS is not going to answer strategic questions about the intentions of Russia over the next 6 to 9 months. Equally, geostrategic reporting is not going to really fit into your firewall detection. Neither of those are wrong. Neither of those intelligence requirements are wrong. They're just not necessarily kind of matched up. If you're looking at scaling that up again, that's a good area for AI to be sort of applied in. Collecting is obviously probably the most obvious area, and this is certainly the area when, you know, I did my master's degree in computer science nearly 20 years ago. People were experimenting this area as well, this idea of like associations. In other words, matching things on the internet to this. That's an obvious kind of area. Analysis as well is a big area as well, where we've previously seen AI being applied. So I2 Analyst Notebook, now IBM I2 Analyst Notebook, we're doing this with Net Reveal over 10 years ago, trying to look at those nets, looking at those kind of connections and looking to model that as well. So again, there is a bit of a lineage in what is quite a new discipline. Dissemination as well. So again, we often think about dissemination as things like this, people still talking about it, but ultimately it's very much still based around written reports with security classifications that go with it. So what makes the difference between a top secret strap 2 security document and a classified document is obviously is more often not obscuring the source, of talking about things in an oblique way. Again, that's a great application of potential AI programs. So what we're talking about here is when, you know, you are a threat intelligence practitioner and you take that step back and you understand what AI is and can do, you can see it can fit into multiple kind of places here. But once it becomes specialized in that area, it would be very difficult to take and apply it to another one of those areas. So again, getting that fit is really kind of quite right. So different tools for kind of different jobs. So what do we do? As Yorgos said, one of the vagaries of cyber threat intelligence is that it produces a lot of its best insight in an unstructured format. So what we're looking at here is some of the sort of legendary reports that came out within the cyber threat intelligence sphere with Mandiant's APT1. Nearly 10 years old now, but when I read that report, it was like reading a top secret strap 2 document that I used to deal with at GCHQ, but now I can just download it from the internet, right? And that was kind of that signal that, you know, that not the documents were being hemorrhaged, but it was this idea of the impact of what CTI could bring. And it's just been followed up as time has gone on. But a lot of the so what is kind of locked away inside there. Also, as well, this becomes a problem as we look at that longer tail of cyber threat intelligence, as it moves outside of government, as it moves outside of the tier 1 financials, as it moves into sphere like civil nuclear, social media. Manufacturing is probably the largest adopter of CTI due to ransomware threat that we've seen in years. The problem that we get is suddenly we're not dealing with professionals who have a military intelligence or civil services background. They are SOC analysts. And a lot of the time, I've seen this within a manufacturing environment, whereas if a piece of cyber threat intelligence is not attached to a very much a defined asset with a defined solution, it just gets kicked into the long grass. It doesn't get addressed, which was somewhat depressing considering how many of these reports I've written over the years. I do wonder who's read them, but hopefully they enjoyed them. So what we're really trying to do is look at this, structuring this unstructured data. Some other reports, this is an interesting report. It was sponsored by Anomaly. However, I think there is some good rigor behind it. And it basically posed how much of a problem this was. So in other words, how many people are consuming unstructured data, CTI data. They came out and they said, you know, you can see at this drop, unstructured PDF and CSV. So hooray for Microsoft, you know, pretty old school there. But, you know, 60 to 62% of people are still consuming CTI within those kind of formats. Even in this year at RSA, we had conversations with people about, you know, how they were scaling, how they were looking at unstructured data. And somebody did say, well, we started PDFing our Word documents and they've grown 10% year on year. And they don't see a problem with that in those areas as well, which is kind of quite remarkable. So what is the key to passing unstructured data into structured data inside a threat intelligence platform? This is kind of what we were all about, really, because we want to sit in between those. So we don't want to be a threat intelligence platform. We don't want to rival something like OpenCTI. We don't want to rival somebody like Recorded Future, CrowdStrike, or those areas as well. What we want to do is we want to be that baton passer between those unstructured data sets into those cyber threat intelligence platforms and assisting in that kind of transfer protocol. Of course, how do we go about doing this? Luckily, there's a number of structures out there. So, you know, there's many principles that I've learned working in threat intelligence, but probably one of the most important is always try and stand on the shoulder of giants. Don't try and innovate, try and look what's been kind of best practice in the past. And we're very lucky in the sense that now we have the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So that good description of tactics, techniques, and procedures, a detailed kill chain of how the adversary goes about doing what they're doing that's actually been quite well adopted across the industry. It's not perfect, but then it was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to be that starting point for that. Also as well, sticks. So these sticks objects as well, which is very much kind of the carrier. We don't just do MITRE, we don't just look at it in those areas, we look at it across other areas as well, so indicators inside sticks. And I think this is incredibly important considering where we're going with this concept of observables in the future, the idea of the existential threat, the idea that indicator-based detection is not enough to guarantee security around that long kind of tail. So we've got the kind of ideological background there sort of sitting within there. And that brings us to our piece of technology, which is called Read. So let's have a quick look. And here is Read in all its kind of silicon glory. So straight away, you'll notice it's running inside a web browser. So a large part of this is we have two main use cases for our technology. One is kind of what we call the headless use case, and that's where it's running at scale behind the kind of open CTI or that threat intelligence platform. It's taking in feeds. We've had an interesting look at feeds. So for example, we're having conversations around parsing Twitter. I don't think it's going to go offline. I think it's probably going to stay online. But the actual amount of cyber threat intelligence being published on Twitter is actually quite significant, with people saying, I found this indicator, I found that, I found this, that, and the next thing. And those micro threat reports are on there. So again, it's that leveraging that full kind of look at that kind of community. Returning to this, what you're looking at here is, for the desktop analyst. So there are many very skilled cyber threat intelligence analysts who don't use a threat intelligence platform, who don't really know what Sticks is all about and don't care. And that's not a problem for them. That's just the way that they're kind of working in that sort of space as well. So there's many people that we speak to who couldn't care less about Sticks, couldn't care less about, but they can still see the benefit of leveraging those kind of unstructured data into a structured format. And we'll get into that in a little bit. So just to talk through the interface and what you can see, I'm going to mess around a little bit with the resolution as we go. But what you can see here on the left-hand side is the options for import. So we have three options currently for import, and that is URL. So probably the most common one is you find CTI all over the internet, blogs and all those kind of things, deeply insightful, high quality and free cyber threat intelligence. So being able to pull that URL is extremely important. Text as well. So again, we're looking at different use cases. So for example, response teams is a big sort of untapped source for cyber threat intelligence because they're doing one, they're on to the next, they're on to the next. But all those emails or those reports, they're compiling, all that type of thing as well, that's an incredibly good source of near real-time cyber threat intelligence that could be ingested as well. Files as well, so we can take PDF and HTML documents. This is useful both in terms of the actual source material. So for example, APT1 is released in PDF, totally unstructured, but also as well, if you come across something that is difficult to parse in a URL format, you can pull that down, you can structure that the way that you want, just using kind of drag and drop and copy and paste. Now then, moving into kind of this section here, we do have private and organizational functions. So we are starting to think quite a lot about how this is being used within the context of an organization. So sometimes you want to keep things secret, sometimes you don't, sometimes you want everybody to know about that, sometimes you don't. But the real point that I would draw attention to here is these little radio buttons here that have the areas and the objects that you have the option to extract from the document. So by default, they're all checked. However, you can uncheck them and move through them. So I find this really useful if, say, for example, I have that kind of strategic question of, what is the crossover between threat group X and threat group Y? I want to look at their attack patterns, not necessarily their indicators. So I want to move up that pyramid of pain to do so, in which case, flick that off, select attack patterns, and then take it through and do that kind of quick, rapid analysis off the back end of it. So when we kind of run through it, as you can see, there's these Trello type boards. So we have for review, reviewing, and then completed. And sort of drum roll, let's have a bit of a jump into one of these documents. Here's one that I pulled in earlier. And this is, a particular sort of document dealing with Fancy Bear and that kind of group in the way that it's sort of working. Again, you can pivot between these pretty kind of easily. So you can see it's that kind of friendly kind of interface. So again, you don't need to be running command lines or anything like that. What you'll see is the coloring, the highlighting. So what highlighting is kind of all about is the different object types that have been pulled out from the document, and a summary at the top. So 26 MITRE attack patterns, 0 campaigns, 127 indicators. There's always loads of those. Malware, 65, tools, 15, and vulnerability, 4. Now, then an interesting point that I don't normally raise with kind of clients, but I think would be kind of interesting to this group because you're considering wider issues on artificial intelligence, is we spent a lot of time looking at the reception of how analysts receive the results from a machine. And what we consistently find, and I'm no exception to this rule, is that threat intelligence analysts are always after the gotcha. They're always like, that I made a mistake there. I gotcha. You know, I found that one there. What they don't do is look at what the machine has done. They consistently look at what the machine hasn't done. So by that, they're not necessarily thinking, okay, it's identified 26 MITRE attack patterns, which is actually quite an onerous task. That's quite difficult to do inside that text. They're simply looking through a lot of the time going, you've missed United States. You've missed that. That's a country. And that area as well. So we're doing a lot of work around that area about how we intersect with the psychology and that reception of the analyst at that kind of point. But what you can do is then start to look through the document. And within the design of Read, it was always meant to be this idea of an annotation tool that the human was helping the human, and the human in turn was kind of helping it. So what you can see here is, take, for example, this example here. So take, for example, up here. So security agency, it's pulled that out and identified that as a threat actor. In this case, CETA is not a threat actor. So in this case, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go in and I'm going to reject that entity type. What we have in the pipeline and the near-term product pipeline, so I'm sort of talking this year and early next, is the creation of what's known as custom rules. So in other words, where if that is done once, it will create that custom rule and will start to apply across that organization. You can see how powerful that would be if you had 10 or 15 analysts doing that. They wouldn't have to do a lot before you start building actually quite a strong corpus of custom rules that will work with the machine learning data to increase and power that kind of result going ahead. Another part is this idea of annotation. So in this case, as you can see, my son's home from school and he's just come into the room. Yeah, I'm just on the phone, Lucian, to some quite important people. Lulu, could you leave, please, my darling? Thank you. I'll catch up later. Bye-bye, Lulu. Bye. Yeah, thanks, mate. Have a great. Apologies about that, but there we go. Yeah. Okay. Moving on. So take, for example, the annotation point here is these are the sticks objects that you can start to annotate with. And this is the important part where we start to look at the difference between MITRE attack patterns and obviously the wider sticks objects here. So take, for example, the indicators. You obviously have different file types and the different sticks objects inside there. The perennial description between a threat actor and an intrusion set, different types of malware and all these types of things as well. So in this case, let's go for, what should we go for? Identity, and let's go for this as a group. So what will happen in the future is the idea of this as creation of a custom rule. The true power, in my opinion, of custom rules is the implications and the links that you can create through them. So for example, Russian government, GRU, APT38, intrusion set, X, Y, and Z. What that is basically relational databases with one-to-many. However, that becomes incredibly powerful when you start to combine that with that. You're almost taking a photocopy of insight and understanding how people are looking at that as well. Kind of conscious of time, so I'll skip on a little bit. But what the annotation essentially does is enrich that kind of document as well. And there's two ways that I go about doing this. So one is obviously going through the text. And what I'm looking for here is the false negatives. So the things that the machine has ostensibly missed. However, a large part of this is assessing the false positives. And what we've consistently seen is our clients turn around and they're not sweating too much the false negatives. They're like, that's okay. What they really don't like is when there's a false positive. So in other words, when we get something wrong, the reason being is this move towards the idea of autonomous cyber defense. So this idea that you want machines running away in the background, you don't want too much human curation, therefore you don't want them getting it wrong, therefore you want a high level of confidence it can deliver on what it's doing. We are addressing this with this confidence level feature here. So in time that will develop into the confidence level that we have around that extraction. However, returning to the false positives and false negatives, what you can do here is pivot onto the sticks graph. So again, this is a really powerful feature. And what it shows is basically that extraction in the raw. Again, at this point, we don't want to be a threat intelligence platform. So we don't want to rival IBM i2 Analyst Notebook or Multigo. But what we do want to do is provide that representation of those extractions so people can start going in and start manually editing those in there as well. Also, critically, this is the area where you can start looking at not just extracted entities, but relationships, because that is, again, a response to this idea of observables, which are fundamentally about relationships in those areas as well. So, you know, it's very easy to create these relationships within the document. Let's go for that. And that's gone slightly off the page, but let's finish in those areas as well. The graph will re-render at this point. However, take it from me, that is the relationship there, and you could go about kind of editing that relationship. So again, within the analytical process, this is getting down into the weeds. This is mirroring the mind of that dedicated analyst who wants to be able to do that kind of nuance, who really wants to be able to get down to the point of the indicator of compromise, mapping to those kind of intrusion sets in those areas as well. So coming back out to the document annotation, you know, this is, again, kind of a really important point. You'll notice this up here. So there's 190 kind of relationships that have been formed, as well as the entity types. You can see this graphically represented here, which is confusing, I think, on kind of anybody's mind. But you've got that graph underneath. It's a lot easier to navigate through, and it's a lot easier to kind of deal with. So again, kind of responding to that user base. At this point, you can pull down the sticks file, you can take it off, you can do that kind of thing as well. However, in this case, we're going to mark it as complete. So there we go. We're marking it as complete, and at that juncture, it moves into the completed column. Now then, the question that everybody asks is, can you compare two documents at this point? That's an obvious thing. Whenever you see somebody in a nodal graph, they just want to merge it with another one and do kind of what I used to call Death Star analytics. So from it looks like a Death Star, and then you start pulling it apart. Deeply satisfying, spent many hours kind of doing that. And the answer is yes, you can through this feature of document collections. So again, I was doing a bit of kind of APT, Russian APT analysis. And what you can see here, I created a container, and it creates 3 of those reports. We can go in and view those reports. So there we go. We've got Bendy Bear, Russian government hackers, and Russian-Ukraine cyber attacks. And again, we can get a visualization of those inside there. Again, we don't want to be a threat intelligence platform at this point. If you want to really do big data, go and buy a copy of IBM i2 Analyst Notebook. It's very, very good at that. It can cope with big data in those areas as well. But what this is for is that kind of desktop analyst who wants a bit of a sense check, who wants to see whether they're on the right path, who wants to visualize these things as well. We do have these layouts inside of here. My own personal favorite is CICE. I'm not sure, but I think it may stand for concise. But we'll see what that does. But what you can see here is straight away, it's kind of clustered these reports. So that's report 1, that's report 2, that's report 3. And what I'm kind of taking away from this is these connections that are between these kind of orbs here. So first of all, we've got Russia. I'm not particularly surprised about that because it's a Russian theme. Yeah, so what? Not really that interested. But I am interested in this, okay, because that's some kind of malware, and that is some kind of MITRE attack TP. So I'm leaning on to that more kind of insightful analysis that's moving away from the world is round analysis to something a little bit deeper. There we go. I'll take a kind of pause at that juncture because that sort of belt fed me with the inclusion of my son who's playing Fortnite or something like that. But I'll take a pause at that kind of juncture and just kind of open the floor to sort of questions, comments. If people want to play around with stuff, they want to see stuff, just come off mute and shout out.
So I will shout out here. This is very interesting. I am an analyst, so you can imagine how
Yeah.
I'm so excited about this. But have you had any contact with SDTerp and the Disarm Foundation and spoken to any of those folks about the integration that they're doing right now with mapping STIX 2.1 with the Disarm Foundation framework that they've put together?
Yes, in a word. So we haven't actually had contact, but we have actually looked quite extensively at the Disarm framework. We do actually have Disarm running inside one of the demos that we've done in an annotation area. We're yet to look at that on the technical base, but my initial kind of sort of feelings is I think Disarm's great. I think it describes misinformation really, really well. But I think the difference between, if you take, for example, Disarm and compare it with MITRE ATT&CK, is what I've found is it's not wrong, it's just not quite right. So it's sort of those critical sort of elements, it's just slightly off by 1 or 2 kind of degrees in there. So I think there's a few elements of like custom objects. So for example, target audience analysis and specifically the use of like emojis and stuff like that is not necessarily within the Disarm framework. And, we're not necessarily talking about like really exotic stuff like virtual reality, misinformation. We're talking about those kind of elements there. I think that presents kind of a problem because you'd then be trying to teach a machine how that kind of bridging language between the classification and the source text and that kind of area between there. I think there will come into alignment as time kind of goes on. Just as we're seeing that kind of crossover between cyber threat intelligence and misinformation analysis and those kind of campaigns. So yeah, I mean, we'd love to be involved in that kind of conversation. I think it's a real important one. I mean, that's clearly something that you're kind of seeing. I don't want to probe too deeply into what you're doing, but do you think that's important?
Well, I do think it's important. I also have made some observations about the use of extensions. In STIX 2.1, we included the extension capability, both for SDOs, SCOs, and SROs. And I think in order to really map the Disarm framework to STIX 2.1, that whole extension process is going to have to be flushed out, and it has to be flushed out at the standards level. It can't if we're really going to advance interoperability in the context of a CTI, it can't be flushed out at the implementation level. So so that's where I see it lacking right now. But I think there's a lot of potential when we really take a look at how important influence operations have become in threat intelligence in general.
Yeah, I totally concur. I think you're, I think there's an obvious crossover between, for example, infrastructure and interoperability between those and kind of stuff. But that's pretty down low on the pyramid when we're looking at kind of, inauthentic content mounted on an IP address. But when we actually get up to that more kind of strategic level around, the classification of the MITRE ATT&CK framework and things like that, I think you're exactly right, is that does need to be a bit more work done to sort of get that kind of conversation going. I think AI can absolutely play a component within that, just in the way that we're sort of demonstrating here, because there is more, I mean, almost all misinformation intelligence analysis that I've seen has been published in an unstructured format. Some Poverty Law Center is a prime example of that fairly enormous data set, right? But yeah, no, it's interesting to hear. Good to hear.
Jane, I'd like to build on this a little, particularly around the point on standards and operationalizing this. One of the challenges that we've had that's slowed us down a little from making a bigger deal out of Disarm and its utilities, that's for standard sticks to objects. We have good ways of downstream tools and good examples of downstream tools utilizing them directly. We haven't seen those downstream tools which are doing this machine-to-machine structured data communication effectively use disarm. So that's been a barrier for us because we can't validate the output of read against that effectively. So if you have any examples of other tooling which is making use of disarm, particularly on the input side, I think that would be really useful and something that we could test integrating with the capability that Stuart mentioned, for example.
So I'm the co-founder of the Sports ISAO, and we've been standing up what we call pop-up SOC operations for major global sporting events since 2016, since the 2016 Olympics. We're in the middle of the Men's World Cup right now, and we are working with Debunk EU. They're based in Lithuania. And we've stood up an instance of OpenCTI. Samuel and Julian have incorporated some of the disarm framework proposed SDOs, narrative, meme, and so we're trying, this is a prototype, but we're trying to capture some of the data from our operation in an OpenCTI instance that Debunk EU has stood up for us. So I anticipate, if we can get the funding, I anticipate continuing with this experiment during the Women's World Cup. That'll be coming up in 2023. And I found that sporting events are really very good opportunities to try to capture APT observation and efforts to disrupt the kind of the global narrative about, an APT's agenda. Back over to you.
Totally agree. Yeah, no, sporting events have been a consistent collection point for CTI for the last decade. I think also as well, the sort of operational security of the APTs tends to go down quite considerably because their operational cadence has to go up, therefore making them much more susceptible to collection efforts and things like that. I think also as well, I think there's a lot of different versions about the crossover between CTI and misinformation. So I've seen a lot of people saying, well, we're seeing, especially around sporting events, the usual tranche of fake tickets and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, that is kind of misinformation because you're getting people to do a behavior based upon essentially fraudulent data. But in my view, that's kind of more complex. That's just complex social engineering. I think that true crossover between CTI and misinformation and disinformation is where you're doing a network intrusion to perpetrate a misinformation campaign that doesn't have an immediate kind of economic backlash. So again, this isn't new. So we saw the Jester active in this against Colonel Gaddafi, years ago, where he was inserting news articles about Libyan soldiers' desertion and then getting them, circulated on major news networks that were then causing actual desertion purportedly. So I think that emergence is kind of there. I think one of the things that also we're developing theories around is if you look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework, it's quite uneven in the sense that when you look to across the right hand side, so for example defensive evasion, there's a lot more data about that. There's a lot more observed defensive evasion because it's quite a tangible thing doing that. So especially in the way that analysts describe that. Whereas reconnaissance is a lot more difficult to detect and it's a lot more fluffy. So an actor using a web browser to look at a website is reconnaissance. However, that's really kind of fluffy language, whereas encrypted command and control is much more kind of specific. I think if you look at the disarm framework, I have the feeling about that as well. So for example, the description of like a data void, there's just no ambiguity there at all. Like that is, what a data void is, well, you will by the time you finish reading it. Whereas some of the other ones, like, some of the earlier phases are much more difficult. So I think merging the two together, you will kind of see that as time goes on. As you can see, I can talk about this all day long, but it's exciting stuff, but I'll stop talking.
So I have a pair of questions. First up, I was curious has Elemendar done any looking into this problem in reverse of receiving lots of machine readable data and creating narratives without a human analyst in the loop? It's something of personal interest. I was just curious if it's an area that you guys have been looking at.
Yep, happy to take that question. So that's not something that we've done a lot of work so far, but it is an integral part of our 2023 roadmap. So one of the, as Stuart mentioned earlier, one of the points of friction that we observed is what happens downstream of our target users. And so specifically, yeah, we can produce that intel in structured format, and then what? What does the analyst do with that when we think about the dissemination or production dissemination part of the cycle? And if you then take that intel into a SOC where folks don't quite have, yeah, that's always a fun link to see. I've been playing with
exactly
that.
Where I was going.
Is that oftentimes folks don't know how to read a graph, right? And that's totally fine. They're not intelligence analysts. They're security operations folks. So our one of the outputs that we're expecting to be building and have in later in 2023 is a we call it cyber graph to text functionality, which is taking those graphs, those knowledge graphs described by Stix, for example, or other ways, and then turning them into summarized text, but not in the same way that you get sports commentary written by robots, where it's all kind of very factual with a little bit of flair thrown in, but having an extra layer of analysis and going, okay, hold on. You don't care about all those indicators. What you might care about is the point that Stuart mentioned, that there is an attack pattern that appears to be common between those two groups. And so there is an element of analysis there in that the functionality will surface and prioritize what a human analyst would find most interesting, because what you don't want to have is a wall of text that describes a 200 object graph in minute detail in human language. That nobody wants that. So yeah, stay tuned. We are one of the things that we're working on this project is having some representation in an advisory board with folks in the industry who can help us review those outputs as they're coming along. So if that sounds like something that any of you would perhaps be a good fit for, then please do say so. We're currently clearing it with some of your colleagues at APL, Harley, and so on, to have some representation from that side. But obviously, if there's other good folks involved, the more the merrier.
Yeah, that also reminded me, Harley couldn't make it today, but he did want me to send his regards. So I forgot to do that earlier. Now,
Jane,
oh, go ahead.
Just quickly before we move on, Jane, it was really good to hear that you're working on operationalizing this interface with Disarm. If there's any way we can be involved or support that project, please let us know, because we've not seen anything like that we can tie into, and we'd be really excited to.
It's still at a very nascent state, but at least we're taking baby steps in that direction.
I mean, you've got to do. It's as simple as that. I mean, our initial interface was simply taking Disarm, loading it in, and then trying to annotate kind of documents based on that recorded future. Do quite a bit on this kind of intersectional issue, give it away for free. It's very interesting, very insightful, and then trying to just match that up was, I was a better analyst by the time I'd finished doing that after like half an hour. So I'm all for something that works here and now.
Yeah.
Not least because I heard some shocking disinformation that England didn't actually win the game that it played on Saturday, which we all know is not true.
It must not be true.
No,
England can't lose.
It's impossible. It's totally impossible. So I'm all for fighting it. Okay. No, yeah.
So just for one more question for you guys is, obviously the goal of this project is we've been looking at some new extensions, or possible candidate extensions to the STIX standard for representing adversary behaviors, ways to detect those behaviors, and ways to correlate those detections. As we start looking at new types of objects, what is the type of training data that would help tools like yours be able to incorporate those new elements if they were to be folded in? Just trying to understand what we might be able to do to help make it easier for companies like yourselves to take advantage of the capabilities we're trying to build here.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when it comes to training any kind of machine learning system, obviously data is critical. Data will never be perfect, and we've done enough of that to not expect it served on a plate. So oftentimes the hardest thing and what we cannot address ourselves is having enough variety of the types of data we're interested in, because the biggest downfall of a system like that is not learning broadly enough to be able to generalize to unseen or previously unseen cases. So we've had we've accumulated and processed a pretty large data set, and even with that, we still know that there are imbalances between the different classes of objects that we got, for example, that give our engineers a bit of a headache, and keep them out at night in terms of the performance of the models. So I'd say if I had to pick one consideration would be whatever we're thinking about those objects, the natural frequency in which they occur with intelligence reports isn't necessarily what you want or what you need to be training machine learning models for. And so, yeah, you need that because you need to understand and tune those kind of base rates. Yeah, typically a report will talk about a handful of threat actors, let's say, but many more indicators. That is good to understand, but in that case, you need enough examples of threat actors across different reports for the model to be able to understand what a threat actor looks like. And so when we're thinking about those new objects, I would say it's having enough of a balance between those two. And in terms of formats, again, there's a bit of a trade-off there because you can't ask for the moon and expect people who write the intelligence to perfectly annotate every instance with what the label that you would like it. Well, also in that case, we'd probably be out of a job. But the having that at least at let's say a document level. So, for example, you get the text and then you get a list of the entities that were pulled out. That is a good start. So it doesn't need to be necessarily more refined than that. It helps to take some steps out the way. If it is, if there are, if there's nice structure around it, if it's in JSON, if it's in JSON describing where it is in the text, that's the dream. And in practice, that never happens. So, we'd much rather have a lot of data that is good enough than not enough data that is perfect.
Okay, thank you. It's kind of what I would have assumed, but I also wanted to ask to make sure that we, didn't ignore other aspects that would be important for you. So thank you for that. Okay. Are there any other questions from the group today? Okay, then I'd like to thank Jeanne Stewart very much.
Oh, hold on, one more. I think Jane's waving a hand.
Oh, sorry, Jane, didn't see your hand.
Yeah, just one quick question. You said that there's a STIX download from your data you can download. Is that 2.1?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm writing that, aren't I, Jude? That was a big upgrade we rolled the other day. So yeah.
Yeah, you can select 2.0, 2.1, and we also support a taxi interface.
Yep.
Where you can transport, I think, over Taxi 1 or Taxi 2, both of those, as well as MISP and our own API. So we try and make it as easy to get data out the platform, because it's not useful if it doesn't.
Great. Back to you, Charles. Sorry.
Oh, no, I'm glad you caught that. All righty. Well, this was a lot of good discussion. So I'm going to forego one of the agenda items, but just more share it for general awareness. One of the suggestions that came up on our listserv over the last month was a request for the development of some indicator of behavior use cases, and more just for our group's awareness. We are working on some initial ones that hopefully at our next meeting in the new year, we'll be able to open up that discussion a little deeper. And we welcome anybody that is interested in collaborating on a set of use cases for the indicator of behavior work. And that will give us, we have 6 minutes left in the hour. If there are any open discussion points that folks would still like to bring up, I wanted to give a moment for that. Otherwise, I will thank our guests and give us a 5 to 6 minutes of our lives back. All righty. Well, as
Just
always,
from our side, I think, thank you very much. It's been great chatting. It's always good to chat with fellow analysts. So thank you very much for that.
Absolutely. We're grateful to have had your time, and also appreciative of those suffering with different time zones. And grateful that your kid walked in and not mine.
There's always one, isn't there?
Always.
There's one.
It's not a child. If it's not a child, it's a cat.
Yeah, it's nice. I've got one of those as well, but yeah, there we
go. But thank you, everybody. And I hope everyone has a great end of their calendar year, and look forward to us getting back together in 2023. So with that said, I'm going to stop the recording. And as soon as I find the button, here we go.